All right, diving in today. And we're tackling this really interesting theme that runs through this whole collection of essays you've given me. It's all about global Christian mission, right? And at the core of it all is this book, Finish the Mission, edited by John Piper and David Mathis. We've got some pretty big names in here, Louis Giglio, David Platt, folks like that. So it's not just going to be a lecture, but more like we're eavesdropping on a really thought-provoking conversation about what it actually means to, finish the mission.
Yeah, and what they do collectively in this book is lay out this, like, foundation, right? Like, what are the core beliefs behind this mission? And then they kind of trace, like, how it's played out historically, and then they really get down to brass tacks, like, what can individuals, what can churches actually do to get involved today? Our goal here is to, like, pull out the key insights, the things that you really need to know about what this mission is, who's a part of it, and why it matters so much.
Gotcha. So we're talking big picture stuff, God's plan for the whole universe, but then zooming in on the practical stuff too, right?
Absolutely. We're going from the cosmic to the everyday.
Okay, cool. So let's start unpacking this. And Giglio, right off the bat, he kind of throws out this phrase, galactic God.
Yeah.
And I got to say, when I first saw that, I was like, oh, okay, here we go, another theological buzzword. But he actually does a great job of explaining what he means. He's making this argument that the sheer scale and the glory of God, like the immensity of it all, it's the foundation for this whole mission thing. It's not just an extra. It's like the very core of why this matters.
Absolutely. And, the key insight I think he wants you to grasp here is that this isn't just some kind of, like, theological poetry. This is, like, the visible, the immense glory of God that we see in creation. That's the foundation. That's the motivation for why this whole global mission thing even matters so much. He points to the Hubble telescope's ultra-deep field, which is like that stunning image of thousands and thousands of galaxies. And, each of those galaxies is as vast, if not vaster, than our own Milky Way.
Yeah, that image is mind-blowing, isn't it? It's almost impossible to even imagine how vast the universe actually is.
Right. It really puts things in perspective.
It does. It does. And he doesn't stop there. He talks about how scientists have actually detected the rhythmic praise of stars through, like, radio telescopes. He uses the Vela pulsar as an example, and then, like, this chorus of pulsars in this cluster called 47 to Canae. It's like the universe itself is constantly singing God's praises, which is...
it's pretty amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's wild.
What's so fascinating here is that, Giglio's point is that this grand symphony of creation that's happening all around us, it's going on whether we humans are even aware of it or whether we're participating in it.
Right.
God doesn't need our worship, but he graciously invites us into it. Yeah. Think about that, right? The same God who spoke this immense universe into existence, he chooses to partner with humanity, with us, in this, like, cosmic project of setting things right after, things kind of went wrong in the beginning.
Right. And so then the Great Commission, that whole idea of taking the good news to every people group on Earth, it takes on a whole new level of significance, right?
It does.
Giglio is saying it's not just a command, like a task that Jesus gave his followers. It's like an invitation to join this mission that's already in motion. And he even brings in Psalm 46.10, where it says, I will be exalted among the nations. And that kind of underscores that this mission isn't going to fail. God is actively working this all out.
Right. And that leads perfectly into David Platt's part, which really digs into the urgency of this mission, building on this idea of God's glory. He talks about that vision in Isaiah 6, where the prophet Isaiah encounters God's holiness. And Platt emphasizes that, when we talk about God's holiness, it's not just that he's sinless. It's more about, like, his otherness, his complete uniqueness.
Yeah.
He's transcendent. He exists on a completely different plane than anything we can even imagine, which is why Isaiah is, like, freaking out, right? He says, woe to me. He's just overwhelmed by this.
Yeah. And then Platt really lays out the reality of, where humanity stands without God. He goes through all these different descriptions from the Bible: rebellion, condemnation, alienation, slavery to sin. We're even called children of wrath. It's pretty sobering stuff.
It is. It is. And, Platt really stresses that when you look at the vastness of God's holiness, the gravity of sin becomes even more apparent.
Right.
And he points to the reality of judgment, the concept of hell, as it's described in places like Mark 9 and Revelation. And it's a tough thing to talk about, But he argues that it's absolutely crucial for us to grasp the urgency of what we're talking about.
Right, right. And then, of course, we get to the good news, the gospel itself. And Platt does a beautiful job of showing how God responds to all of this brokenness.
Yeah, he does.
He talks about Isaiah being cleansed with that burning coal from the altar, the Passover lamb, the Day of Atonement, and then Isaiah 53, where it talks about Christ taking the punishment for our sins. It's like this incredible picture of God hating sin but loving us so much that he sent his son to die for us.
Yeah. Platt emphasizes that at the cross, Jesus took the full penalty that our sin deserved. And in that moment, God's justice and mercy meet in this amazing and transformative way.
Yeah.
And this understanding, he argues, this should fuel us. It should give us this incredible urgency to share this truth with people who haven't heard it.
So shifting gears a bit, your sources also talk about this really interesting trend, which is the evolving landscape of global Christianity. They point out that the West, which for centuries was like the center of Christianity, is becoming increasingly post-Christian.
Right.
And they back this up with some pretty eye-opening stats. They say that around the year 1900, Europe had over 70% of the world's professing Christians. But by the year 2000, that number had dropped to less than 30%. It's a huge shift.
It is a huge shift.
Yeah.
And at the same time, we've seen this explosion of Christianity in what's often called the global south. So that's Africa, Latin America, and Asia.
Yeah, the numbers are incredible. Like, Africa went from roughly 10 million Christians in 1900 to 360 million by the year 2000.
Yeah, it's amazing.
It's almost half the continent. And they even mention that the number of Christians in China, actively practicing Christians, it's probably comparable to, if not larger than, what used to be called Christian Europe.
Wow. It's remarkable, right? It really is a historical shift in where Christianity is centered in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And as Michael O. points out later in the book, it means that the idea of missions is no longer just like a west to east or a north to south kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's becoming this, global, multi-directional movement, he calls it, from every land to every land.
So with all this growth in the global south, does that mean the West is off the hook when it comes to missions?
That's a good question. And your sources are pretty clear that that's definitely not the case.
Okay.
They actually stress that the West still has a vital role to play. And it's not just about, sending money, although that's important too. They really emphasize the need to send people, to build genuine partnerships between believers in the West and those in the global South. That act of going, they argue, is still super important, especially for making disciples.
And they bring in some stats from the Joshua Project that really highlight this. They say there are still thousands of people, groups around the world who are considered unreached. That means they have very limited, if any, access to the gospel.
Yeah.
And even more concerning, a lot of these groups are unengaged, meaning there's currently no intentional missionary work going on among them. It's a sobering reminder that there's still so much work to be done, and it requires a truly global effort.
It does. It does.
So your sources also talk about some of the challenges that come with engaging in this mission, right? Michael Ramsden really dives into some of the intellectual hurdles, like how do we address those philosophical and scientific objections that people raise against Christianity?
Right, right. He tackles that head on, doesn't he?
Yeah, he does. And one of the things he addresses is this idea that faith and truth are somehow separate, that they don't go together. But Ramsden explains that the biblical idea of faith pistis in Greek, it actually involves a deep trust in what's true. He uses this helpful analogy of having faith in a government. Whether or not you personally agree with everything the government does, it still exists. It operates based on certain principles. And having faith in it means trusting those systems.
Good analogy, yeah.
Yeah. He also tackles the God of the gaps argument.
Yes.
Which is this idea that science has basically made God irrelevant. But Ramsden clarifies that the God of the Bible isn't just there to fill in the gaps in our scientific knowledge.
Right, right. He makes a distinction between scientific laws, which describe how things work, and divine agency, which is about who's ultimately in control. He uses this analogy of a house. Just because we understand how a house is built doesn't mean there wasn't an architect or a builder who designed and created it.
Exactly. And he doesn't shy away from the influence of humanism either. Yes.
That worldview that says humans can create a better world through their own efforts and reason. And he raises this really interesting question. Are our Christian efforts sometimes being influenced by that secular humanism without us even realizing it?
It's a good question. Is it diluting our reliance on God?
Yeah, exactly. And Ramsden also talks about the challenge of affluence, which is something that we in the West probably struggle with more than we realize.
Yeah, I think that's true.
That comfort and ease that comes with wealth, it can subtly shift our priorities.
Yeah,
And it might actually hinder us from really engaging in the mission, which often involves sacrifice and self-denial.
yeah. And it's interesting, he quotes this professor, Avner Offer, who said that the rewards of affluence produce the disorders of affluence.
Wow.
It's a really thought-provoking statement, isn't it? Like, is our comfortable lifestyle actually getting in the way of us meeting the needs of the world? That's a good question. And Ramsden also reminds us of something that can be easy to forget, which is that Christians in many parts of the world face intense persecution.
Oh, absolutely.
He even shares this email that he received about the kidnapping of people who were just worshiping in Peshawar. It's a chilling reminder of the cost of following Jesus in some places.
Yes. And it's a good reminder that the word martyr comes from the Greek word marties, which just means witness.
Oh, wow.
So these early Christians who were killed for their faith, they were ultimately witnesses to the truth of the gospel.
That's powerful. So moving from the challenges to the more practical side of things, Michael really emphasizes the importance of prayer when it comes to, actually finishing the mission.
Oh, yeah. He talks about that line in the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come. And he's basically saying that we need to be praying that constantly and actively seeking God's will to be done on earth.
Yeah. And he also talks about this idea of living theistically and Christocentrically. It sounds complicated, but it's basically just living with a constant awareness of God and with Christ at the center of everything we do.
Yeah.
He even uses this example of a concert master who uses his musical talent not just for his own enjoyment, but to organize benefit concerts.
Yeah.
Like finding ways to bring God glory in everything we do.
Yeah, that's good. He also talks about the importance of stewardship, especially when it comes to our finances. He emphasizes the importance of tithing, giving 10% of our income to the church, and then also giving generously to missions.
Right.
And he even suggests maybe going beyond the tithes, giving a higher percentage of our income if we can. It's about intentionally using our money to advance God's kingdom, right?
Yeah, making a real investment.
Right. And he shares this really moving story of a young teacher who felt called to give a significant portion of his salary, even though it wasn't a lot, to support the development of young leaders in ministry around the world. It really highlights the power of sacrificial giving,
Yeah.
It really emphasizes that when we give to God's kingdom, it has an eternal impact. It's different from just giving to, like, general aid organizations, which can be good, but their impact is often temporary.
Right.
He's saying we should invest wisely.
Yeah.
Like really look for ministries that are strategically focused on missions and making disciples.
Yeah, that makes sense. And he also talks about the importance of, like, families being open with their kids about money and teaching them about biblical stewardship from a young age, which is something that
Yeah, I think that's so
a
important.
lot of people probably don't do enough.
Absolutely.
So throughout the book, we get all these really inspiring stories about what God is doing around the world. Like, they talk about reaching transgender individuals in Brazil, a Filipino maid who is sharing her faith in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and the incredible growth of the church in Africa, even in the face of intense persecution. And then that story about the Christians in North Korea who have lost everything, but they understand that they have nothing to envy because they have Christ. That's just so powerful.
It is. It is.
Really is.
So Ed Stetzer, he picks up on this theme of the sentness of the church. That just as the Father sent Jesus, so Jesus sends us out into the world. And he connects this back to the Great Commission and its focus on reaching all nations.
Yeah, and he traces that idea all the way back to the Tower of Babel in Genesis.
Oh, right, where God scattered humanity.
Right. And what Stetzer's arguing is that the event of Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit empowered believers to speak in all these different languages, it was like a reversal of Babel. It signified that the mission would go out from Jerusalem to all nations, not through force or political power, but through the power of the gospel being proclaimed in people's own languages.
Right. And Stetzer also brings in the Trinitarian aspect of all of this, referencing Jesus's words in John 20.
Yeah. And then he talks about this challenge of, like, how do we engage our local communities at the same time that we're focused on global missions? And he's basically saying that both are essential. Our own Jerusalem is just as important as the ends of the earth.
Right. And he points to Psalm 67, which is this prayer for God's blessing on his people so that the whole world might know him.
Yeah.
He's saying that God gives us material wealth so that we can use it to spread his message, to bring the world to worship him.
Hmm. That's interesting. So John Piper then shares some of his own experiences of how God calls people to missions. He talks about how God uses specific verses of Scripture to speak to individuals and guide their path.
Yeah.
And Michael Ramsden, he shares a similar experience, talking about how he wrestled with this call to ministry, even though it meant turning away from more lucrative career options. And he emphasizes the importance of prayer and seeking wise counsel when you're trying to discern God's will for your life.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not always an easy path, is it? Definitely not. And then they kind of circle back and define some terms like what they actually mean by unreached.
Mm.
So that's people groups with less than 2% evangelical Christian presence and very limited access to the gospel.
Right.
And then there's unengaged, which refers to those unreached groups where there's no known missionary work happening at all.
Right. So even more isolated.
Yeah. And they highlight this area called the 1040 window, which has a really high concentration of these unreached people groups. And it's also an area with a lot of poverty and persecution of Christians.
It's a very challenging area of the world.
Yeah, it is. And something that really stood out to me was how they talked about the role of single women in missions.
Yes, that's so important to highlight.
Because they often play a vital role, but their contributions aren't always acknowledged. And then they talk about short-term missions, those trips that people take to other countries.
Right, right. And they're careful to point out both the value and the limitations of those kinds of trips. Yeah. They say that if they're done well, in partnership with long-term efforts, they can be a catalyst for lasting impact.
Yeah.
But they can also be harmful if they're not done thoughtfully and sensitively.
Yeah. And then finally, they really emphasize that disciple making, which is something every Christian is called to do, not just pastors or missionaries. It's an intentional, relational, and gospel-centered process.
Absolutely. Oh. And they go back to Timothy 2.2, where Paul talks about passing on the faith to faithful men who will then teach others also.
Right.
It's about multiplication.
Mm-hmm.
And they're honest about the fact that it's hard work. It can involve suffering, but it's ultimately powered by God's grace.
Yeah. And they close with some really powerful stories about how seemingly small acts of obedience and generosity can have a huge impact.
Right. When we place our lives, our resources, our everything in God's hands, amazing things can happen.
So to wrap up this whole deep dive, I think the big takeaway is that finishing the mission is complex. It's rooted in the very nature of God and his love for the world. It's global in scope, and it requires every believer to get involved using our unique gifts and talents. It's not always going to be easy, but it's ultimately God's plan. And as we've seen, God's plans always succeed in the end.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
So on that note, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. Remember that story about the North Korean Christians who had lost everything but said they had nothing to envy because they had Christ?
Yeah, that's it.
It's so powerful. So my question for our listeners is this. What does it really mean deep down to live as though Jesus is absolutely everything? How would that change the way you see your role in God's plan for the world? And what's that one word that captures your heart's response to God? It could be worthy, like Michael mentioned, or something else entirely. And then how does that one word translate into action, starting right where you are?